Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out. I'm your host, Chris Gorin. In January, Chinese AI lab Deepseek stunned the world by releasing a powerful, cost-efficient AI model that quickly rivaled Western giants like OpenAI, leading to debates about the effectiveness of U.S. export controls and America's technological advantage. Joining us now is Matt Pearl, Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., to discuss the implications of DeepSeek on national security and the future of the AI industry. Matt Pearl, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I actually just want to start with the latest news as of this recording. On Sunday here, Baidu, the Chinese tech company, released their own new AI models, which seemed to be aimed at rivaling DeepSeek. One of them, their reasoning model, Ernie X1, reportedly perhaps outperforms DeepSeek at half of the cost. So what is the significance of these Baidu models from your point of view? And does it change anything about the AI race as it stands now?
It really emphasizes a lot of the advances that the PRC is making in AI. And unfortunately, those advances really call into question some of the competitive advantages that we thought that US firms had. The Chinese firms appear to be able to develop very energy efficient, cost efficient models. And it really emphasizes that the ability to make money on these AI models and monetize them is going to be very limited. And a lot of the market is shifting toward AI applications, which wherever you are, whether that's the US or third countries, is going to be great for companies because they're going to be able to use these applications very cheaply. But at the same time, it means that non-PRC companies are really need to up their game and turn more toward open source and really find ways to be cost efficient and energy efficient in order to respond to Baidu and Deepseek.
Well, it's interesting that you say that companies should be turning towards open source because I know that you've written specifically about the potential dangers of open source models like DeepSeek. So why don't we talk about that just a little bit? When it comes to open source models, what are the specific dangers that you're concerned about?
Well, open source can be a double-edged sword. The advantage of open source is that it's possible to vet the code. It's possible to have third parties discover bugs and vulnerabilities. And so there are good things about it. But then obviously, if it's open source, it's possible for malicious actors to also obtain the code. I just think that the reality is we can't control what the PRC is doing. I think what's more significant is the fact that when the PRC is developing these models, they don't take security into account at all. There's essentially a diktat from the government saying, whichever company can advance the furthest and do so the cheapest way. And so, for instance, Cisco tried several malicious prompts, cybersecurity and other malicious prompts against several models, including OpenAI, Anthropic, DeepSeek. And 100% of them worked against DeepSeek. And that's not because DeepSeek's open source. It's just because the way that it was developed, was not with these vulnerabilities in mind. So if you compare it, for instance, to Llama, which is Meta's model, that's Facebook's model, that does take into account cybersecurity in a way that the PRC models just don't, unfortunately.
Over there at CSIS, you recently released a report on DeepSeek and its geopolitical implications, including some previously unreported information about chip smuggling and the specific technologies that they're using. So for our audience, maybe just remind us a little bit about why DeepSeek caused such a panic when it first came out, and also the main findings of this report.
Before DeepSeek came out, we thought that the non-PRC companies like Meta and Anthropic and OpenAI really had moats, which means that they were protected against other AI players because of the scale of the investments they could make, their access to very high-end chips, and their ability to consume energy. And so we thought that all of those things really meant that it would be difficult or impossible for PRC companies to do the same. And what we discovered with DeepSeek is that the PRC companies are becoming very innovative. We saw this with Huawei, right? Where they were cut off from Western chips. Some of them are smuggled in, obviously, or they obtain illicitly. But the reality is that they also get very creative about using lower end chips in order to do these workloads and to make advancements. And so in the case of DeepSeek, we saw basically them leveraging the same sorts of techniques that Huawei did in terms of using these lower end chips very efficiently. And so it does raise questions about the effectiveness of export controls.
Where are US export controls effective at slowing down Chinese AI development, and where do they seem to sort of be failing at that goal?
So I would say that it's not clear that the export controls are slowing down development significantly. I think if you look at what the export controls do, they impose costs, meaning that it's more expensive. It can be challenging for the PRC. They have to find workarounds, and so it can make things more costly for them in some ways. But ultimately, if they're determined to develop these models using some smuggled chips, some stockpiled chips, as well as some lower end chips, they're going to be able to do it in relatively fast time.
So ultimately, do you feel that these export controls on chips and AI diffusion are an effective policy and a wise policy moving forward?
I think that they should be one tool in the arsenal that the US and its allies and partners use. I do think that, as I mentioned, it's important to balance the benefits and the costs. And when I say benefits, I mean that you're making it more difficult for the PRC. But it should be one tool. It's not a panacea. And I think that there was a view that it was a panacea. You need to combine different tools, right? Like boosting production in US allies and partners. You need to use R&D to make sure that we run faster and develop better technology than the PRC. We need to really protect our IP and ensure, there are all kinds of efforts, but we need to be careful about taking them too far.
Simply put, do you think that DeepSeek is a national security risk?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly because at this point, anyone can still use it. So it could be a vector for all kinds of things, spying. It would be very easy to use it to leverage a malicious cyber attack if the PRC wanted to. And so, as well as misinformation and trying to do influence campaigns that change perceptions of the PRC. And it hasn't been banned in the US. Now, President Trump could ban it under the same law that Congress passed to ban TikTok. He would just have to determine that DeepSeek is a national security risk. When I speak to people in a lot of our allies and partners in those governments, it's a very similar situation to Huawei, which is they recognize this is a risk, they recognize the threat, but they're also worried about retaliation from the PRC. In the case of businesses, it presents risks of IP theft that they should really take into account. Once they're installing DeepSeek and using it on their IT systems, and it could be a vector for obtaining access to their actual operational technology.
So you really feel that this could be sort of a vector for corporate espionage or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're installing this app on a corporate device, for instance, it'd be very easy to use it in order to obtain sensitive information. And the PRC has a history that this isn't only going to be information that would be useful to DeepSeek. The PRC really forces its companies in some ways to cooperate in this spying on behalf of each other. And so even if you're a company in a completely different area, but you have valuable IP, the PRC is going to see that as a vector to obtain information.
One issue that might matter to everyday users, especially those that live in politically sensitive environments like Taiwan, is around AI and information. Now, we've tested DeepSeek ourselves on sensitive political questions about Taiwan. And interestingly, when asked if Taiwan is an independent country, it initially generates the kind of nuanced response that you might expect from any of the most popular AI models, but then immediately deletes its answer, stating, "Sorry, that's beyond my current scope." And we see the same pattern for other sensitive issues like Xinjiang, Tibet, or even the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. In fact, if you ask it any question about the year 1989, it just refuses to say anything. Does this particular phenomenon highlight any risks or concerns for you?
It does. I mean, obviously, there's the basic concern about, trying to prevent individuals from getting information. But it really highlights a deeper concern, which is that, the examples you bring up are very, funny and interesting. But, we are going to have deep relationships with these AI models, right? The ones we prefer. We're going to really trust them. In some ways, we're going to personify them. We're going to really rely on them for advice to function in the world. And so, what it raises for me is the more subtle ways that an influence campaign could be conducted in the context of an election where the PRC prefers one candidate over the other. And so, I think that's the context in which it gets very disturbing, particularly in the U.S. and a lot of other countries. We're in these polarized times where we have very close elections. And so it wouldn't take much for one of these models, if people are relying on it, to swing an election, which is very disturbing.
In Taiwan, despite being the place where most high-end AI chips are made, in terms of AI models, it's been a little bit lagging behind. Now, Foxconn has created its own LLM known as FoxBrain, which it says is going to be the best performing model in traditional Chinese, at least, but they acknowledge that it's a little bit behind Deepseek and other models in terms of its performance. So, what explains this kind of AI gap? And what can Taiwan do to try and catch up?
I think before DeepSeek, it was just really hard for Taiwanese companies to make the sort of massive investments that the US companies were making in AI. In many cases, they just didn't have the ability to invest that a Microsoft, for instance, has. And it was the PRC that really first developed this more energy efficient, cost efficient way to do AI rather than Taiwan. But I would be relatively optimistic that we're going to see companies in Taiwan and elsewhere that will develop really efficient, effective models. It's really important that there's an effort on cybersecurity in Taiwan. I know that the government and TSMC and others are working very hard on it, but we really need to have a lot of international information sharing, multilateralism. And so this needs to be a group effort where we try to secure things, or ultimately, the PRC is going to have such an advantage because they have innovators, they have the ability to develop things, and then they'll also be able to obtain all of our sensitive information, including in Taiwan and the US and elsewhere.
If you're saying that what's really needed now is collaborative efforts among allies, I would say that most people wouldn't necessarily categorize the early days of this new US administration as one focused on that particular goal. In fact, pushing many allies away in many cases. I guess, do you expect that to improve at all in the near future?
Unfortunately, I think it's going to continue to be a challenge. It seems that the administration is really quite determined on issues like tariffs, and is not going to stop doing that. And that is something that is going to push some allies away. I do think that there may be a rethink at some point. And so I would look for that opportunity. It's important for other governments, companies in Taiwan to really emphasize and educate the US government on the value that they bring to things. If we didn't have TSMC, we wouldn't have any of the technology that we do in the US, quite frankly.
Matt Pearl, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me. These are important issues. I really just enjoyed discussing them.
For more from TaiwanPlus, visit us on social media or check us out at TaiwanPlus.com. I'm Chris Gorin. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.